Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. We're in between. My name is Anna Tellerico, and I am a master's PhD student in the Curatorial and Art History Studies program at Virginia Commonwealth University. It is my esteemed honor to introduce a speaker whose professional contributions to architecture of the Islamic world and its history have advanced our understanding of the relationships between culture, spaces, and society. Dr. Mohammad al-Asad has held teaching positions in both the United States and abroad, and is currently the director of the Center for the Study of the Built Environment in Amman that he established in 1999. Dr. al-Asad received his PhD from Harvard University, and his works have been published in both Arabic and English. His research, including his 2016 publication, Shaping Cities, Emerging Models of Planning and Practice, focuses on both historic and contemporary scholarship of the architecture of the Islamic world. Presenting his lecture, Whose History Is It Anyway? The Presence of the Past in the Architecture of the Lands of Islam Over the Past Century and a Half, please join me in welcoming Dr. Mohammad al-Asad.
Thank you for your kind introduction. When I was asked to give a presentation about the relationship between the architecture of the past and the present in the contemporary Islamic world, I felt this would be an interesting opportunity for me to revisit a paper I wrote 25 years ago, which was, I'm getting quite old, which is entitled The Reinvention of Tradition, Neo-Islamic Architecture in Cairo. I hope to reassess some of the issues I presented in that paper, but also to extend its chronological scope. That paper extended up to the early 20th century. With this presentation, I'd like to go all the way up to the present. When we think about the whole concept of inventing traditions, we can also use the term constructing traditions or even identifying traditions. We should probably go back to the 15th century, specifically to 15th century Italy, when there was a fascination with the architecture of ancient Rome. And as a result of that fascination, an architectural tradition was invented, that of ancient or classical or imperial Roman architecture. With time, this interest extended beyond Italy. And so we have other parts of Europe looking into the architecture of the past and again inventing architectural traditions such as Carolingian architecture, Romanesque architecture, and Gothic architecture. And as soon as these invented traditions came to being, they were activated into contemporary architectural production. The first example is that of the Renaissance, which was basically an activation of ancient Roman architecture in contemporary Italian architecture in the 15th century. With time, Europe or the West, sometimes they're synonymous, sometimes they're not, but that's beyond our scope today or my scope today. This interest in the architecture of the past extended beyond the Western world. And what we start seeing is Europeans looking into the architecture of non-Western societies. And not surprisingly, among the first they looked at was the architecture of the lands of Islam, considering the close geographic relationships and also considering the intensive levels of interaction that existed between the West and the Islamic world over the centuries. And one of the first examples we know of inventing Islamic architectural traditions is found in the writings of Johann Bernhard Fischer von Erlach, an Austrian architect and author. And around 1720, he published a book entitled A History of Architecture. And in it, he invented three traditions. He talked about Arab architecture, Turkish architecture, and Iranian architecture. So his invention was partly based on geography and partly based on language. And in his book, he provided us with examples of these traditions. So we have, for example, a drawing of the Haram in Mecca. And we have, for example, in it a drawing of the Mosque of Sultan Ahmad in Istanbul, among many other depictions of other monuments. The drawings were not that accurate, which is not surprising, considering that he depended on secondary sources such as the descriptions of travelers. And following that, we also have a number of Westerners who now lived in the Islamic world. An example is Jean-Baptiste Van Moor, who actually lived in Istanbul for over a decade at the beginning of the 18th century. And he provided us with drawings of interiors, of people, and of architecture. Here we have people and interiors, and we have here another drawing of the Mosque of Sultan Ahmed. Again, not very accurate. It's probably because he drew it after he left Istanbul. Following that, over the next, let's say, century and a half, we have almost an avalanche of explorations of the architecture of Islamic lands carried out by various Europeans. Not surprisingly, the British, because of their colonial interests in the Indian subcontinent, started publishing images and text about the architecture of the Indian subcontinent, including that carried out under Muslim dynasties. So we have William Hodges publishing his drawings of Islamic or Mughal architecture in India. We have Thomas Daniel and his nephew William also publishing their drawings of that heritage. This usually took place between the late 18th and early 19th century. One of the most interesting and systematic explorations of an architectural tradition from the Islamic world is found in the Description de l'Égypte. You know, this is the multi-volume work that was published during the first quarter of the 19th century and which was carried out by the scholars who accompanied Napoleon during his expedition to Egypt from 1798 to 1801. And, you know, it's this wonderful publication that covers all sorts of aspects about life and natural history and the geography of Egypt, including its Muslim architecture. So if we take a look at the drawings provided in that book of the mid-14th century Mosque of Sultan Hassan, we notice we have an extensive and very accurate set of drawings that include elevations, sections, plans, detailed drawings, as well as perspective drawings. And the French, in general, were very active in this exploration of the architectural past of the lands of Islam. For example, in 1830s, we have M.A. Delannoy, who published a book about the architecture of Algiers. Of course, as you can see, all of these are connected in one way or the other to colonial activities. And we have a very important figure. I will be returning to him. His name is Pascal Coste, a French architect who in fact lived and worked in Egypt in the 1820s. And then he traveled to Iran and he published works on both the architecture of Egypt and the architecture of Iran. This was during the second half of the 19th century. So here we have a drawing by Coste of the Mosque of Sultan Hassan. Here we have the courtyard of the mosque. And here we have a drawing of the pavilion of Sheikh al-Sutun in Isfahan, also by Coste. Not surprisingly, the West was, of course, interested in the architecture of Al-Andalus, or Islamic Spain. We have James Kavanagh Murphy's work from 1814, and the well-known publication about Alhambra by Owen Jones and Jules Goury from the 1840s. So by the second half of the 19th century, we really have a significant body of works published by Westerners about the architecture of the Islamic world and sort of all sorts of traditions being invented in relationship to it. Many of these publications were by artists and by architects who did not have very good knowledge or deep knowledge of local histories and local languages. And also, what is interesting is that these artists and architects, in their exploration of the architecture of the Islamic world, basically depended on a classification system based on geography, which is very rational and a very logical way of dividing that architectural heritage. By the end of the 19th century, we have more scholars taking part in this process. But what is interesting is then they take all these basically geographic classifications and just lump them together under that wide, large umbrella of Mohammedan and later Islamic architecture. And this is really, as we've seen already, a term that is problematic and that we continue to struggle with up to this day. Now, what about the activation of these invented traditions into contemporary architectural production in the West? When do we see these vocabularies of architectural revival or historicist vocabularies of Islamic architecture in the contemporary architectural production of the West? The earliest examples we know of, or among them, is this pavilion in the shape of a mosque found in the gardens of Kew from around 1760. It no longer survives. And to me, it has a very interesting characteristic that just stays with these Neo-Islamic vocabularies for the next 2 centuries or more. And that is that we have a lot of cherry picking, a lot of eclecticism. So, you'd have one building and it would have elements taken from Al-Andalus, elements from Mamluk Cairo, elements from Ottoman Turkey, elements from Mughal India, as well as even contemporary Western vocabularies, all put together into one building. And I will come back to this issue later on. Let me just give you a few examples of these Neo-Islamic buildings. In no way am I presenting a survey. I'm just sort of giving you a very quick sampling of the variety we see. We have, this house in Sezincourt in England from around 1806. We have the wonderfully eclectic Royal Pavilion in Bath from the 1820s. We have a water pumping station from Potsdam from the 1840s. We have a cigarette factory from Dresden from the early 20th century. And of course, we should not exclude the world expositions that took place in European cities during the second half of the 19th century. This is from the Paris 1889 exposition. There's a reconstruction of a traditional Cairo neighborhood. In fact, a construction crew from Cairo was brought in to develop this, to create this building. Now, what about the exporting of all of these vocabularies from the West to the Islamic world? This started, as we know today, at a relatively early time, from the early 18th century. Of course, by then, Neo-Islamic vocabularies had not come into being, so the West was basically exporting its own architectural vocabularies to the Islamic world. And the earliest examples really consisted of very minor architectural details, and what we see is a connection between Paris and Istanbul. And in fact, it was a two-way process of interaction. But I'm interested in the one going from Paris to Istanbul, and historians have referred to that as the Tulip period in terms of architecture. And one of its better-known examples is the fountain of Sultan Ahmed III near the entry to the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. This is from around 1720 or something of that sort. At first view, this looks like a typical Ottoman building from that period. But if we look more carefully and we look at these sort of gilded, natural-looking floral details, we begin to see that something new is happening and that there are influences now being brought into the architecture of Istanbul from abroad. With time, this influence becomes more widespread. It becomes more present, it becomes more assertive, and historians have referred to this as the Ottoman Baroque period from the middle of the 18th century. One of its better known examples is the Nur Osmaniya Mosque in Istanbul from around 1750. Sorry, there should be, I'm missing a slide here. That's too bad. I don't know how that disappeared. But in any case, this mosque, in it we start seeing, for example, the appearance of the modified versions of the classical order. We start seeing the ubiquity of curved lines, surfaces, and decorative details, a certain sumptuousness to them that we don't find in classical Ottoman architecture. So we really see a bigger influence of the West by the middle of the 18th century. Another very interesting building of the Ottoman Baroque is the reconstruction of the Fatih Mosque, or the Mosque of Mehmed II, the Ottoman Sultan who conquered Istanbul. This was destroyed as a result of an earthquake. It was reconstructed in the 1770s according to this Ottoman Baroque vocabularies. Again, with time, this influence becomes even more pronounced and more powerful and more assertive. So when we move to the 1820s, we take a look at a mosque in Istanbul, such as the Nusratiya Mosque. Here, in fact, the influences no longer are limited to architectural details, but begin to affect the whole composition of the building. So this mosque does not have a courtyard, which is very unusual for an imperial Ottoman mosque. Instead, what we have here actually is this sort of pavilion tacked on the top or on the front of the building, and it consists of a portico in the middle and two wings to the sides, almost a Renaissance structure tacked onto an Ottoman mosque. And then with time again, this influence extends beyond Istanbul. We see it now in the second largest city of the Ottoman Empire, in Cairo, during the rule of its governor, Muhammad Ali. And he built this Ottoman Baroque mosque, the Mosque of Muhammad Ali, between 1830 and 1848. Interesting, another image is missing. But actually, the influences of Europe now become very evident, for example, in the columns, which I wanted to show you, of the courtyard, as well as, for example, that clock tower you see sort of in the distance. Now, what about the exporting of neo-Islamic architecture from Europe to the Islamic world? This takes on at a much later stage. We have an early example of an unbuilt work. Again, we go back to Pascal Coste. As I mentioned, he lived and worked in Cairo during the 1820s, and Muhammad Ali, we just saw his mosque, asked him to give him a proposal for the mosque. And this is what Pascal Coste came up with. It's very interesting in that he put a lot of Mamluk elements together, but then he arranged them in a Beaux-Arts arrangement, where we have very strong total symmetry and a strong sense of frontal axiality. And I will come back to this whole concept of a local morphology combined with a Beaux-Arts syntax. But one of the earliest examples we have of a neo-Islamic work of architecture in the Islamic world is probably the Jazeera Palace in Cairo from around 1867. This was part of the construction frenzy that took place in Cairo just before the opening ceremonies of the Suez Canal. Empress Eugenie of France stayed in this building. It's a very interesting structure. It was designed by a group of European architects. The most important of them was Julius Franz, a German architect. Parts of it, actually, the iron parts were manufactured in Germany. Then they were shipped to Cairo, and they were assembled in Cairo. Seems all these images I don't know how this has happened. There's another image that should have been there that's missing. Very strange. Although I went through the images yesterday. But I wish I had the other image. Still, if you look at this building, you can see that it has a strong Andalusian feel, a strong feel from Islamic Spain. And this brings me back to the comment I mentioned earlier, that in these neo-Islamic buildings, you have a great deal of actually cherry picking. So you have a building in Cairo, but it's actually, taken from Al-Andalus thousands of miles away. It's as if they're all the same in many ways. And we have this character really being very much part of neo-Islamic architecture in Cairo, or in the Islamic world in general. And this is also evident if we go to Istanbul from 1889. This is the Sirkaji railroad station, again designed by a German architect, August Jachmund. And if we look at it, there are elements that seem to have a Mamluk influence. There are elements that seem to have a Mughal influence. And if you look at the central part, it's actually even a Second Empire element from European architecture. So again, this incredible eclecticism is found in these early examples of the introduction of New Islamic architecture in the Islamic world. And here I should probably make some comments about this phenomenon. It never really started on a solid footing. It never really established very deep roots. One, it was a Western invention. Two, it was introduced by Western architects. But that's not the most important issue. The more important issue is its eclecticism. So as I said, you'd have a building in Cairo, but it would have Andalusian, Ottoman, Mughal, Western elements all sort of mixed together. So it was very alien to local communities. It really didn't make much sense. And these buildings, which were supposed to be neo-Islamic, were as alien to the local community as would be, let's say, a classical revival or a Gothic revival building. So there was that kind of characteristic to them. Nonetheless, we do see some interesting examples in the Islamic world of architects trying to develop neo-Islamic vocabularies that looked at the local heritage. And one of the early examples is the Mosque of Al-Rifai in Cairo, which was from 1869, so around the same time as the Jazeera Palace we just saw. It's an interesting structure because it was not completed until 1910, 40 years later, but for a variety of reasons I will not go into. Now, this one was designed by an Egyptian architect, not a foreign architect, but he was trained abroad. Hussein Fahmi, he was trained in France. And what we see here is a building that very faithfully and accurately copies elements from Mamluk architecture, from the Mamluk architecture of Cairo. You know, the domes, the minarets, the architectural details were very faithfully copied from specific prototypes. But all these were actually placed together within an overall arrangement that emphasized strong symmetry and overall frontal axiality. So once again, we are going into an example, and this is another facade of the building, where what we have are local elements combined with a Beaux-Arts arrangement. And in that sense, what we have is something going back to Pascal Cost's design from 1840s for the Mosque of Muhammad Ali. And again, a similar process is found in Istanbul. This is the central post office building from around 1909, again designed by a Turkish architect, Vedat Tek. Again, he was trained abroad. He received part of his training in Germany. And if you look at a number of the features of the building, we will notice that they are taken from the historical tradition of Ottoman architecture. But once again, there's an emphasis on total symmetry, on frontal axiality, again, sort of a local architectural morphology, but presented within a Beaux-Arts syntax. And this goes on for decades. You know, this kind of neo-this and neo-that architecture. You have examples of neo-Islamic architecture now spreading throughout the main cities of the Islamic world. And this includes, you know, neo-Islamic architecture, classical revival architecture, Gothic revival architecture, the whole mix, the whole scope of historicist vocabularies taking place throughout the Islamic world. But as I said, one does not feel that they really ever took deep roots. The big change now starts taking place in the 1930s and more so in the 1940s. And I'd like to show you two interesting examples of that. This is the Shadirji house in Baghdad from the 1930s. It was designed by Kamil Shadirji, a very important public figure, Iraqi public figure. It was designed by a Syrian architect, Padri Qadah, who studied at the École des Beaux-Arts, but then sort of started drifting towards the Bauhaus. So what we have here now is a building where the past is banished. There is no room for the past. It's a modernist building. It's a Bauhaus-influenced building. It really is, you know, a building that could appear in anywhere, let's say, in Central Europe. If we go to Cairo, we have this multi-story apartment building, also from the 1930s, by Antoine Nahas, a Lebanese-Egyptian architect. Again, it is a building that has no place for the past. It is really a building that emphasizes and in some ways announces its modernity, very much influenced again by the Bauhaus. So how do we explain or how do we look at what has happened now? Here I'd like to go to the writings of Rifat Shadirji, the son of Kamil Shadirji. Rifat Shadirji was born in 1926. I would say he's the most important author on architecture, not only in Iraq and the Arab world, but in the Islamic world during the late 20th century. Shadirji made an interesting argument. He felt that, or he feels that architecture is really a result of a process of dialectic interaction between two poles. On the one hand, we have the pole of technology, more specifically building technology. And on the other hand, we have the pole of social needs. And by social, he really means it in the widest sense of the word. And technology is a relatively straightforward topic to understand. Here we have to keep in mind that between the middle of the 18th century and the early 20th century, we've really seen a complete transformation in how buildings have been put together. This was a period in which materials and techniques, new ones, came into being that totally transformed building. Here we're referring to structural steel and iron, to reinforced concrete, to wide panes of glass, to the elevator, air conditioning. All of these truly transformed architecture. And in the middle of the 19th century, or the second half of the 19th century, we have numerous authors in the West who were saying that we now have to develop architectural vocabularies that express these new technologies. We can't keep on building these sort of buildings that depend on modern technology, but then we wrap them with historicist vocabularies. There was a feeling that architecture needs to be honest, it needs to express its time, and it needs to express its technologies. So that is the issue, the pole of technology. Social needs are far more complicated because this issue covers so much. On one level, we want buildings to satisfy certain utilitarian needs, but we really expect much more of architecture. At a certain level, architecture is an expression of wealth and of power, especially high-end architecture. And often we, as historians and critics, that's what we actually deal with. And that is what most of the public knows. And then architecture has to deal with that messy concept of identity, a truly messy issue, particularly since we often deal with a plurality of identities. You know, identity might be connected to nationalism, it might be connected to ethnicity, it might be connected to religion. It might be based in the past, it might emphasize the present, it might look into the future. Identities might be universal in nature, or they might be almost tribal and parochial in nature. And often, with the messiness of identity, it's all of these lumped together, and architecture has to express all of them. Something interesting happened in the 30s, and more so in the 40s after World War II. There was that confluence between identity and the emphasis on technology. There was a feeling that the past has been too painful. 2 world wars had happened, and the past had played a role in them. Many of these wars were connected to nationalism, and nationalism often is related to reviving glorious visions of the past. So there was a feeling that too much pain has been connected to the past, and it's time to really push it aside. On the other hand, technology can be a wonderful now element of identity, because technology promises a better life for everyone, it's future-looking, and also it sort of brings humanity together, in that who you are or your role in the world is not about your past, it's really more about your ability to master technology and to master science. So there was a big change there. And if we look at the 2 main forces, political forces of the world in the post-World War II era, they were both, at least in terms of what they announced, were adopting this emphasis of an identity based on technology. We're talking about the communist bloc led by the Soviet Union on the one hand, and the Western liberal democracies led by the US on the other hand. And in fact, if we look, for example, at the space race in the 1950s, that really it was an expression of that. So both the Soviet Union and the United States were competing because it was more or less to show which had a better grasp, a better control, let's say, over technology. And in the Islamic world, this was actually embraced with enthusiasm. The Islamic world now was much of it was getting independence, new nations were being formed, and the past had certain negative connotations, at least the last 2-3 centuries. The past was associated with underdevelopment, with backwardness, and with colonialism, and the humiliations of colonialism. On the other hand, if one looked at technology, then one could look at something that is future-looking, that allows the Islamic world to take part in the international community, not simply because of who they are, but basically through their ability to master technology. South Korea is a good example of that. You know, as a country that was very poor, very backward, all the way until the 1960s, and then through a process of industrialization, through mastering technology, it has become one of the more advanced countries in the world. And in fact, what we see in the Islamic world in the post-independence period are massive projects of industrialization, and these were celebrated. And they were in many ways often, you look at stamps, you look at currency, and you see that these were very much part of a new identity. And architecture now was used to express this new identity. So architecture started moving away from the past and now establishing a clear modern vocabulary, one that celebrated technology to a large degree. And so during the 1940s, 50s, 60s, into the 70s, what we really see is an architecture that very much emphasized a modern character throughout the Islamic world, the main buildings that were built across the Islamic world in the main cities of the Islamic world, and really the past had almost been banished. Then something interesting happens. We have the advent of the postmodern period in architecture, which is different than art, I feel. There was a call again. Again, it originated in the West and then was exported to the rest of the world, and I'll come back to that. But there was a feeling again that we really should bring the past back into the architecture of the present. The Islamic world, again, embraced this with a certain level of enthusiasm, partly because the modernist project that had gone on, let's say, from the 40s to the 70s had not gone as well as one had hoped. So there was a feeling, let's give the past an opportunity again. And if I am to think of a father figure for the postmodern period in architecture in the Islamic world, I would assume it would be Hassan Fathi, the late Egyptian architect. Hassan Fathi is very well known for his design of the new Gurna village in Egypt during the 1940s. And there he very deliberately decided not to use a modernist vocabulary for the construction of this new village. And instead, he went for the traditional vernacular architecture of the Egyptian countryside. It was a revolutionary moment. But the world and the Egyptian architectural community did not take Fathi very seriously. They ignored him, they sidelined him. And that was until the 1970s, with the advent of postmodernism, suddenly he was given center stage. Two of the better known practitioners of, let's say, the architecture of postmodernism in the Islamic world probably would be Abdul Wahid al-Wakil, the Egyptian architect. This is his Corniche Mosque in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. And Rasim Badran, the Jordanian architect, and this is his great mosque of Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. And actually this shows now, during this period, it's another subject, but the central role that a country such as Saudi Arabia now was playing in defining the architectural scene in much of the Islamic world, partly, of course, because of the presence of Mecca and Medina within their boundaries, but also because of their tremendous wealth, which allowed them to become an experimental ground for architecture. I remember I was a student during much of that period, and we all thought that a new era in architecture has arrived, one in which now the past finally will have a place in the architecture of the present. But that did not happen. In fact, the architecture of postmodernism started fizzling away during the middle 1990s. I'm not sure I still have a good explanation for that. Part of it could be that it was very much, again, in the Islamic world at least, it was a Western construct that was exported to the Islamic world. And in fact, even though the period of postmodernism had a good run in the Islamic world, when we think about its great icons in the world, actually we do not think of the Islamic world, we think of something like the eighteenth building. I think now it's the Sony building in New York City, designed in built in 1984 by the late Philip Johnson. So the architecture of postmodernism and the presence of the past again started fizzling away. And as one looks at the architectural scene in much of the Islamic world over the last 25 years or so, it's an architecture defined by a great deal of variety and diversity. But actually, it is also an architecture that in its great, let's say, most important icons across the Islamic world, in cities, it is one that has gone back to a modernity, a sense of modernity. And this I find rather puzzling because the last 25 years and more in much of the Islamic world have been years in which there has been a very strong, assertive emphasis on reconstructing visions of an Islamic past on the cultural, social, and political levels. But for some reason, architecture has not been used as a tool to express that. It is as if the words of the famous modernist architect Le Corbusier have become a reality. He always said that architecture is a machine for living in. And here actually we see now architecture being used as a machine. In some ways, in much of the Islamic world, we feel that architecture has become almost like a car or like an appliance. There's no such thing as an Islamic car or an Islamic refrigerator. These are industrial elements. And so if we look at Burj Khalifa in Dubai, what we really see here really is a building that celebrates technology, that emphasizes an identity through technology and is intended to more or less assert Dubai's role as a global city. But there's one building type that has always managed to maintain the past in the architecture of the present, and that is, of course, the mosque. It is the most important building type in Islam. And here I keep thinking that this is not surprising since religion, to a great extent, really is a historical phenomenon. And what has happened with the mosque in the modern period, and here I'm talking about the 1940s to the present, is that an interesting formula has emerged. And that is whenever you build a mosque, you include certain elements that are based in the past. These elements actually did not come into being with the birth of Islam, but they emerged by the end of the 1st century of Islam. Here I'm referring to the minaret, the dome, the apse-shaped mihrab, and the sort of applied decorative motifs that are usually either vegetal or geometric in nature. And if we look at a mosque, a well-known mosque, such as the Great Mosque of Kuwait from the 1980s by the late Iraqi architect Mohammad al-Asad, we see a sort of toned-down version of this formula. The elements, by the way, I should mention, usually come from Al-Andalus, Mamluk Cairo, Ottoman Turkey, and Mughal India. Usually these are the 4 sources. So what we have here is something very clear in terms of the use of the formula. We have a cubical form, we have a dome on top of it, we have the projection of the mihrab, and we have a minaret to the side. And this, in some ways, really summarizes the architecture of the mosque during much of that period. But there is this very fascinating family of mosques that's emerged over the last 50 years that actually has attempted to emphasize and assert a modern character to the mosque and has basically moved away from the past, either by heavily abstracting these elements, the dome, the minaret, etc., or by simply completely doing away with them. One of the earlier examples, this is just an interior of the Great Mosque of Kuwait, where again you see the mihrab, you see the dome, you see this sumptuous level or arrangement of applied surface decoration. Now, one of the earliest of these modernist families, this modernist family of mosques that I know of, is the Mosque of Aisha Bakkar in Beirut from 1970 by the late Jordanian architect Jafar Tuqan. You look at the form of the mosque, it has nothing to do with anything we know from the past. There is no dome. There is a minaret, but it's this very futuristic, almost space-age vertical element. Even more daring is this prayer pavilion in the Textile Museum in Tehran from the 1970s by Kamran Diba. What we have here is simply 2 cubes, an outer cube that is arranged with the grid of the grounds of the museum, and an inner cube that is basically directed towards the direction of the Qibla. There is a slit in each cube, and the 2 slits create an access towards the Qibla. We have the fascinating Sharafuddin White Mosque in Visoko in Bosnia. Here the influence of, let's say, Le Corbusier and Alvar Aalto, 2 of the great architects of modernism, is very much evident. We have the very daring mosque of the Grand National Assembly in Ankara, the Parliament Mosque. Here, actually, the mosque takes the shape of a pyramid. The top of the pyramid takes the place of the dome. It doesn't show in this image, but where there should be a minaret, there is a poplar tree, and the mihrab is actually, as you can see, this large glazed surface that overlooks a sunken garden. If we look at the last 10 years, there is this wonderful, crisp, clean, white Shangawan Mosque in Bangladesh. We have a very simple King Abdullah University for Science and Technology Mosque in Saudi Arabia. We have the Ar Capita Mosque in Bahrain with its pure forms, just a cube and this vertical element in place of the minaret. This is a mosque that Princess Wajdan just showed us. It is the Sanjaklar Mosque, which is sort of buried into the ground, a very unusual arrangement for mosque architecture. Or this very interesting mosque, Shakib Arsalan Mosque in Lebanon, where what we have are these sort of vertical steel bars or iron bars that more or less allude to a historical presence of the mosque. And towards the end, there is this fascinating Baytur Rauf Mosque, which Princess Wajdan also showed us in Dhaka in Bangladesh. Here we have, again, no dome, no minaret. We do not have a mihrab. What we have are slits in the walls that bring in light. That is all. We do not have any applied surface decoration. It is actually the brick that is used to construct the building that create very powerful patterns as natural light falls on them. And as I think of these mosques, I cannot but go back to a very important writing from the mid-18th century. It is by Marc-Antoine Logier, Essai sur l'architecture, essay on architecture. Logier, at the risk of oversimplification, basically argued back in 1750 that architecture has been corrupted because of the applying of layers and layers of decoration over the years. And to him, we needed to go back to the origins of architecture. We needed to purify architecture, to distill architecture, and that can only happen by going back to the beginnings of architecture. And to him, this was, as he expressed in his famous frontispiece, the primitive hut. To him, architecture goes back to the primitive hut, which is 4 columns made of unfinished tree trunks, and a gabled roof made of unfinished tree branches. And this actually is considered by many the first work, written work, that called for the establishment of a modern architecture. And in some ways, we can think of these modernist mosques that I've shown you, almost an expression of the writings of Laugier, in that these architects are trying to more or less distill, to purify the architecture of the mosque from the layers that have accumulated in the past, and to go back to a historically independent rediscovery of the mosque that is based purely on architecture, on form, on space, on light, on texture. So to end, I cannot say I have any good answers about the relationship of the past to the present in the architecture of the Islamic world today. For one thing, the past is very messy. You know, we construct the past. Sometimes we fabricate it. Sometimes we tolerate it. Sometimes we accept it. Sometimes we embrace it. Sometimes we ignore it. And sometimes we reject it. So our relationship with the past is continuously changing. If we look at the important icons of architecture in the Islamic world over the past 25 years, definitely there has been an emphasis on a sort of modernist, technologically inspired vocabulary, not on the past. And I would go as far as saying that I'm not sure, if we look at the expressive intent or the communicative value of architecture, if the past is always a main issue or a main concern. Sometimes it is a main concern, sometimes it exists somewhere in the background, sometimes it is not a concern. And as I think about the expressive intent or the communicative value of architecture, it is really my feeling that the one thing that's consistently been there always, that architecture has always been used to do, which is really to more or less function as a form of expressing power and wealth, which is something very primordial, actually. Thank you very much.